All right. Welcome, Sarah. After hearing about Ben this morning, we're now heading south for another NNR at Ben Lawers. And Sarah has 7 years working on this ecological project herself. We're going to be hearing about the whole 40, but she's now studying her PhD and managing conservation at the Corrour estate. So I'm going to hand over to you, Sarah. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Yeah, it's wonderful to be presenting today on 40 years of rare plant monitoring at Ben Lawers NNR. And for this talk, I'm going to give you a rundown of the key highlights of the monitoring work ongoing at the site, along with where we are now in terms of population trends of some of Britain's rarest plants, and focusing particularly on the effects of climate change, which of course are acutely relevant during the current fortnight of COP26. But firstly, just to introduce myself, so I did a degree in ecological sciences at the University of Edinburgh. Then I worked as the seasonal ecologist for the National Trust for Scotland at Ben Lawers for 7.5 years, having volunteered there previously at the site for 3 seasons prior to that, so really 10 years in total. I left the trust in 2020, and now I'm the conservation manager at Corrour Estate in the Highlands, also working part-time alongside my ongoing PhD research into montane woodland restoration based at the University of Stirling. And this summer, I also continued some of the rare plant monitoring at Ben Lawers as a contractor and self-employed ecological consultant. So from working at Ben Lawers, I've kind of become the national expert in snow purwort, or Sejana nivalis, to use its scientific name, which is pretty niche specialism, if I'm honest. So it's one of my most favourite Arctic alpine plants, and you'll hear me mention it quite a lot today, but that's also because it has a very important story to tell indeed. And as an aside, I'm also particularly proud that I managed to combine my work at Ben Lawers in the mountains with also becoming a mother and having 2 children at the same time. And it's really important to recognise just now that the content of the talk today is really a collective effort by many individuals over 4 decades. And I'm incredibly grateful for all this, particularly to Dan Watson and also Ben Lawers property manager David Marden, and then subsequently property manager Helen Cole. There's also been vital contributions from a long list of seasonal ecologists at the NTS and volunteer assistants as well. And thanks also to my colleagues at the University of Stirling who've been helping me with data analysis of the population trends and the paper that we are currently preparing for publication on this work. So Ben Lawers is a mountain range in the Central Highlands just above Loch Tay, which contains Ben Lawers itself, the 10th highest mountain in Britain at 1,240 metres tall. But there's also 6 other Munro summits on the NNR as well. And it has been owned and managed by the National Trust for Scotland since 1950. What is really special about this site, though, is defined by its geology. So it's composed of calcareous Dalradian mica schists, and it's the combination of high altitude and calcareous geology, which means Ben Lawers is home to the best collection of Arctic alpine flora in Britain, and in fact, the highest density of nationally rare mountain plants. The site covers an area of 4,500 hectares, and it's very highly designated as a SSSI, an NNR and SAC, Special Area of Conservation. And it includes nationally important habitats such as alpine calcareous grasslands, alpine flushes, alkaline fens and snowbed habitats. And the NTS, it was the first NTS property purchased primarily for nature conservation, and the site's also famous for its pioneering habitat restoration work, particularly in montane woodland habitats. But also, as an aside here, the large herbivore exposure at Craigenglochen at Ben Lawers was erected in 2000 and has produced the best example of restored upland tall herb habitat in Britain. And we were able to demonstrate that after the large herbivores were removed, the tall herbs were able to come off the cliff ledges into the grassland below. And the monitoring plots that were set up before the fence was installed showed a huge increase in tall herb cover by nearly 30% plot cover after just 18 years. So that's a real conservation success story. But the focus for the talk today is on high altitude flora. So here are just a few examples of the famous plants occurring at the sites. These photos were all taken by myself, and in the case of the dripping saxifrage and snow pearlwort, the fully open flowers of these plants are rarely ever seen in Britain, really only just by a handful of people in the last half century or so. So I was incredibly lucky to get these photos. These are all nationally rare plants. There are about 17 nationally rare plants on Ben Lawers, nationally rare being that it's a species that occurs in 15 or fewer 10 kilometre squares in Great Britain. Some of these plants occur only at Ben Lawers and nowhere else in Britain, or they occur at just a couple of other sites in Britain, but for quite a few of the rare Arctic alpines, Ben Lawers holds by far the most significant population in the whole country. So many of you as botanists will certainly be aware of the importance of Ben Lawers in the national context, but it's also incredible that its importance goes far beyond just being a great site for plants in Britain. So it's what we call in global change ecology a disjunct mountain outpost site. So that means that the Arctic alpine species are occurring here at the very edge of their global range. In fact, typically at the low latitude margins and well away from the range core. And these disjunct Arctic alpine populations that persist on mountain outpost sites are the limit of their distributions and their climate relics that offer a particularly sensitive indication of global change effects. Range edge populations can actually exhibit rich genetic diversity and distinct local adaptations in comparison to the range core. And so they contribute significantly to biodiversity and provide important functions within local plant communities. So investigating which groups of Arctic alpine plants are most threatened on mountain outpost sites will be critical for developing targeted conservation action to preserve their valuable genetic resources and evolutionary potential during global change. So that's really the crux of why 40 years of rare plant monitoring at Ben Lawers is so important on an international level. So in the late 1970s, there was a concern that the Arctic alpine flora at Ben Lawers was declining, in part due to historical over-collecting of these species, because climate change at that time wasn't really on the radar. So it was decided to initiate a population survey of the nationally rare plants occurring at Ben Lawers, and the monitoring work was managed by David Marden, the property manager. But 1981 is really a key year because this is the year that Sandy Payne spent the whole summer recording all the locations of the rare plants occurring across Ben Lawers, along with providing an estimated count of abundance. And it's a really incredible achievement what was done in that 1 year to map all the sites across the NNR of these rare species without the use of up-to-date records or GPS that we have the luxury of today. And then this work's been repeated by property staff ever since on a cycle of approximately 6 years by whoever was the seasonal ecologist at the time, and involves visiting all the sites known for each of these rare species on the NNR and updating the site details and GPS coordinates, taking photographs of the sites, but most importantly, tagging and counting all the plants present for the target species of interest. So these tags that we used are tiny zinc nails with just a strip of duct tape put around them for the flag part, so they're homemade. And they're really important for separating the search and find operation from the actual counting, which is done once all the plants at the location have been found. And they're really useful because many of the Arctic alpine rarities are incredibly small, they seldom flower, and they look very similar to other more common species. So once you think you've searched and you've managed to tag all the plants, like you tag them every time you see one, once you think that you've done that and you've found all the plants that are present at that site, then you count up the flags as you remove them to get the final count. So the flags are very, very temporary, just to help with the counting operation. And this work is physically demanding as well as being technically demanding, because it often took us to the tops of the Munros, also on very challenging terrain, and it could be anything from kneeling all day in freezing wet alpine flushes to scrambling on very steep and rocky terrain. And I'm quite proud of this photo on the left here, because I was actually 6 months pregnant at the time and still carried on this monitoring work well up until I was 8 months pregnant with my second child. So yeah, what we end up is lots of detailed maps of all the locations of each species occurring across Ben Lawers. And then there's counts of the number of plants at each of these distinct sites, which are then combined to give a full population census for the NNR. And the rare plants are generally distributed across the NNR, so on the surrounding Munros, as well as on Ben Lawers summit itself. So this long-term population monitoring is really essential for detecting population trends, evaluating threats to these species, and informing conservation management decisions. However, such reliable botanical recording and monitoring continuity in mountain environments is often limited by factors such as remoteness, access, challenging working conditions, time constraints, because it takes a long time to get up there each day, and resource allocation. So it's more common often to have surveys that are just sampling a small part of a larger population. But what we've got here from Ben Lawers is a really unique data set, complete population counts for the whole site, which in the case of the snow pearlwort, Sejarah nivalis, actually represents a full population count for the entire British population of this species. And this has only been possible through the rigorous long-term monitoring programme and staff continuity at the site. Many of these Arctic alpine plants are incredibly difficult to survey if the location itself at the top of the mountain isn't enough. This highly specialised botanical knowledge is absolutely essential. Really, without prior experience of the site and its flora, many of these species would be near impossible to identify and monitor to the same consistently high standard year on year, especially as you have to rely on vegetative features rather than flowering. So now I'm going to show you the key findings from this monitoring work, and I'm going to focus on just 10 plant species here. So you might notice that there's a few famous plants such as alpine gentian that appear to be missing, but that's because the data that we've used here is for the 10 species that have had full population counts done consistently and regularly since the 1990s. So the other species don't have the same depth of data, usually because it wasn't feasible to count every single individual. So this chart here is drawn up for the data with the year on the x-axis. You'll notice it only goes back to the early 90s because these are the surveys we can be confident that we have the full population counts done rather than more rough estimates. But I did say the monitoring started in 1981, so please don't think that anything prior to the 1990s isn't important. In fact, quite the opposite. Without all the pioneering work done in the 80s, mapping the locations and etc., we wouldn't have the knowledge, the depth of knowledge with which to start the full population censuses with confidence. So all the data here is underpinned by the initial surveys from 40 years ago. And then the y-axis, we have the percentage of the baseline population. So I've taken the early 1990s survey as the baseline, and all subsequent counts are calculated as a percentage of this value. So the 100% line means that the population is the same size and hasn't changed since the 1990s. I haven't used actual count values because then it wouldn't be possible to compare trends between the different species. That's because some species have populations that order in the hundreds of plants, but others have several thousands. So we wouldn't really be able to standardize or compare things between species without using percentage to standardize it. So most species have had for about 4 population surveys done between the early 1990s and the present day. So I'm just going to go through some different groups of species with different trends. The first group here have actually shown population increases in the last 20 years. So there's Cystopteris montana, mountain bladder fern, a fern of sheltered rock ledges, scorched alpine sedge, Carex atrophisca, and close-headed alpine sedge, Carex norvegica. These are sedges of well-vegetated stony flushes. And then Veronica fruticans, the rock speedwell, a herb of sheltered rock ledges. And I should point out, the lines don't all go up to the present day because monitoring was done on a cycle of 5 or 6 years. So the data just goes up to the most recent survey. Then we've got 3 species who've maintained a similar population size over time, more or less, with some fluctuation. There's Woodsia alpina, the alpine woodsia, alpine fleabane, this Erigeron borealis, and finally alpine forget-me-not, Myosotis alpestris. And these are all plants of herbaceous rock ledges. So yeah, more or less stable trends for these species. But you've probably anticipated what is coming up next. So unfortunately, there are 3 species which have shown significant decline since the 1990s. So Saxifraga cernea, that's the dripping saxifrage, a decline of 54%. Sabulina rubella, that's mountain sandwort, was quite recently still called Minuartia rubella, so that's had a name change. That was gone down by 58%, and fortunately my favourite of all, Sagina nivalis snow pearlwort, a decline of 66% of the entire British population in the last 17 years. So yeah, quite a worrying trend there for that particular plant. And all 3 of these are plants of sparsely vegetated, high altitude habitats, such as snowbeds. And the 2, the Sabulina and the Sagina, the 2 that have declined the most, are actually cushion former plants, low growing plants with a very dense rosette forming a cushion. So just to then put it back all together, we've got quite a varied picture here then. So some of the rare plants are doing just fine or even increasing, which is great. There's been a fair amount of fluctuation, as you would expect, in population dynamics. But unfortunately, some are showing worryingly negative trends. And we've, with the help of my colleagues at the University of Stirling, very grateful to Catherine Mercer for this help, using generalized linear mixed effects models, using the raw data counts for each individual sites for these species across the NNR. And it does confirm what we see on this chart here, that the populations of the 3 species at the bottom have declined significantly over time. But there's also something really interesting going on with altitude. So to put this in the context of altitude, here are the same plants, this time with their most recent population count relative to the 1990s baseline, plotted against the maximum altitude they occur at on Ben Lawers. And there's actually a significant relationship between the 2, as shown by this trend line. So this R² value is basically saying that about 50% of the variation in population changes between these species is explained by their maximum altitude at Ben Lawers. And there's a negative relationship. So the species that have declined the most are also the species which occur highest up the mountain. So just to talk in some more detail about our 3 decliners. Not only are these declining species found higher up the hill than the others, as I've just shown, they've also actually shifted their lowest altitude limits up the hill. So Saxifraga cernua, previously its lowest altitude at Ben Lawers was 1,139 meters. Now its lowest altitude is 1,161 meters, bearing in mind the summit is 1,214, so that's just 50 meters. The lowest altitude for this species on Ben Lawers is 50 meters below the summit. And then looking at the bottom of the table, Sagina nivalis, again, it used to be found at 840 meters, and those sites have now gone extinct. And the lowest altitude which it currently occurs at is 915 meters. And these observations are consistent with global predictions of climate change induced reductions in high elevation floras. And they align with research showing global shifts in community composition on mountain summits and accelerated declines in rear edge low latitude populations of Arctic alpine plants. So you'll see it's also really important here that for the Sabulina and the Sagina, these are populations, the populations at Ben Lawers are actually the very southern limit for this species across Europe. So it's really significant what's going on here. And again, to draw your attention to the fact that all three of these plants are plants of sparsely vegetated habitats. So although upward migration of species in Arctic alpine habitats is generally occurring worldwide, these disjunct populations already situated at local maximum elevational gradients are actually expected to face what we would call mountaintop extinction in the future, because there's really no higher ground available for them to retreat to as temperatures rise. So you get the loss of the lowest altitude sites. You would expect that they might move uphill, but in this case, there's just no higher ground left for them. And this has been talked about a lot as a potential climate change scenario, but we actually have now real scientific evidence of it occurring rapidly in Scotland. And yet, so just to draw your attention again to the fact that these two species, Sabulina and Sagina, this is happening at the very southern limit of their European distribution. And these two species are also both cushion formers. So why might this actually be happening? So here in this chart, I'm plotting again the current population size relative to the baseline. That's the left-hand y-axis, sorry, the left-hand y-axis. So that's the crosses there, showing descending trend of population size relative to the baseline from Cystopteris montana, which has got an increase, and then all the way over to Sagina nivalis, which is the most, has shown the biggest decrease in population size. And that's been plotted against these site pressures that we observed over time, looking at the photographs taken at each site for these species. With the right-hand y-axis showing the proportion of sites experience these different visual pressures. So there's been a lot of sites for our three decliners becoming more vegetated over time, also being subject to pressures such as landslip and rockfall, whereas the other species on the left-hand side, Cystopteris montana, etc., there's been really much fewer these visual impacts, and even Caryopsima vegica, there's been no change at all. So habitat type and growth form is really important here. The three decliners, as I say, plants of open and snowbed habitats with very much a lot of bare soil, free from competition from more vigorous species, and particularly the Sabulina and Sagina being low-growing cushion formers, and therefore they're pioneer species which are much more vulnerable to competitive exclusion by other more vigorous species. So yeah, the threats that these plants are facing are dynamic habitat processes such as landslip and rockfall, some localized trampling, but particularly encroachment by the surrounding vegetation. But climate change is actually exacerbating this through a process called biotic homogenization or mountain greening. basically upland vegetation becoming more similar over time as specialist Arctic alpines are replaced by generalist lowland plants. So shifts in Arctic alpine floras are therefore occurring as a consequence of warming benefiting more vigorous plants rather than simply because of the direct effects of temperature changes on high altitude species. And snow cover here is particularly important because it stabilizes Arctic alpine communities, protects them from the erosive processes such as landslip and rockfall. And earlier snowmelt will alter vegetation phenology and lengthen the growing season, further facilitating the invasion of taller and more vigorous species previously restricted to lower elevations. So our three declining species are those which require the most open habitats free from competition. Perhaps Myosotis alpestris hasn't declined as much, that's the alpine forget-me-not. Even though it's quite a high altitude plant as well, it does quite well in herb-rich ledges surrounded by other tall plants. So the other species, although still nationally rare Arctic alpines, are not quite as fussy in their requirement for low competition than the cushion formers, and they're less affected by encroachment of more vigorous plants. And they're less dependent on the requirement for extreme high altitude and snow cover on the mountaintops. So here we have a comprehensive long-term data set which encapsulates the emerging threat of climate change on our biodiversity. And these plants at Ben Lawers represent disjunct populations persisting at the limits of their species range, and they're therefore of international importance. There's been some divergent trends, but we found that there's quite an important effect on altitude. And three Arctic alpine specialists have suffered severe declines of over 50% of their population in just 17 years. And they have become extinct, died off at their lowest altitude locations. And so I think that Saxifraga cernua, Sabulina rubella, and Sagina nivalis should now be considered at risk of extinction in Great Britain. And so there's serious implications for the conservation of key regional biodiversity hotspots located at low latitude mountain outpost sites, such as Ben Lawers. But you might say, to play devil's advocate, why does this really matter? I mean, I've explained about the importance of these populations in an international sense for biodiversity, but even so, why does this matter? We all know climate change is happening now, and there's so many problems associated with this. Should we be really concerned about the loss of these plants, these climate relics at the edge of their distributions? But I think we certainly should. If we move away now from the science and the numbers and go beyond the facts and the figures kind of into the realms of the emotional response, because losing these plants means the loss of the cultural and inspirational value that rare species represent. So speaking for myself, before I came to Ben Lawers, I was a student studying ecological sciences, kind of with a leaning more towards animal biology, if I'm honest. But being at Ben Lawers completely turned me into a botanist and plant scientist. Getting to know these plants intimately was important for me and my own confidence personally as a botanist and a scientific research. But also the botany at Ben Lawers inspired my love for plants in general. And now, because of that, I've moved on to become a conservation manager, carrying out landscape scale ecological restoration and climate change mitigation. And I'm not sure I would have ended up doing that if I hadn't started caring so much about the Arctic alpine plants and their upland habitats. So I know many of you listening today will have been inspired by Ben Lawers, or if you haven't been there yet, you maybe just be excited by the fact that it and the rare plants exists. And I'm sure you will have a species or a plant community that's influenced your life in a meaningful way, inspired you to get into botany more, maybe to carry out some conservation work or get others involved in botany and plant science. And I mean, how would you feel if that special plant or habitat disappeared, or if it never even existed for you to enjoy in the first place? So without these rare species, rare floras, or even just interesting plants and habitats, our lives would be so much less richer, and I think we would be much less inclined to fight for nature conservation and preservation of biodiversity. And I mean, that's why the work of the BSBI itself is so important, because it helps to facilitate this knowledge exchange and pass on love of plants to others. And so we need to keep this alive for the next generation of botanists, such as my daughter, Georgia, here in the picture, who's been lucky enough to see the rarities of Ben Lawers for herself. And she's pictured here next to the drooping saxifrage. So that's the end of my talk. Here is my other child, my son, displaying his love for snow powerwort as a baby. And yeah, I'd just like to say it's been an absolute honour to be involved with these rare plants over the last 10 years. And I'm really grateful for that experience and being able to share it with you today, and now happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was fantastic. Jim, where are we going to start on the questions?
Yes, Sarah, fantastic talk. Great photographs. I just absolutely loved that. A question from David Welsh. Is there any sheep grazing on Ben Lawers meantime? And I suppose a question from me is that sheep grazing adversely affecting any of the populations he talked about?
I think Ben, actually, David actually responded to his own question underneath to say that actually the slides had demonstrated there was grazing. So he'd asked specifically about how grazing affects the vegetation encroachment on the bare ground.
Ah, right. Yes, I see that now.
Yeah, it's important to point out that there is grazing by sheep on Ben Lawers, although it's more complicated because it's associated with heritable grazing rights at the bottom of the mountain. So the grazing rights aren't necessarily owned by the NTS, so they don't necessarily have control of the sheep grazing. So yeah, it is a very important part of the dynamics in montane environments, having grazers or not having grazers, or the density of grazers. And some habitats, such as calcareous grasslands, which include the famous alpine gentian, do certainly rely on some level of grazing and disturbance to keep the habitats open. So that's certainly important in this context. Although sheep and their grazing, if there's too much, it can definitely be detrimental. And I have observed trampling by sheep in snow powerwort plots, definite hoof prints, and then the sheep can then completely sort of erode and make a sheep trap with very little vegetation at all, which does go through some of these sites. And then it also encourages rockfall and landslip as well, because everything's much looser and less stable. So, but some of the good snow powerwort sites do still occur in places that are quite heavily grazed. So it's not necessarily a concern, but I think decline of snow cover does make these places more vulnerable to trampling.
Okay, that's great. You mentioned trampling there. Can I ask, is there any evidence of human trampling been a problem at population level? This is a question from Peter Gordon.
Yeah, very localized, and I have observed it, unfortunately. Some of the sites for these plants, particularly drooping saxifrage and the other saxifrage, are fairly well known. I mean, it's wonderful that people can come up and see these for themselves. So I'm not saying don't do that, but the snow powerwort is often quite close to some of these, and I have observed, I think, a footprint on a snow powerwort ledge, probably by someone who had just had no idea that it was there. I mean, it's, even if you're experienced, it's really difficult to see them because they're only about 1 centimetre big at maximum for most plants. So I think somebody was looking for drooping saxifrage and there was a bit of localised disturbance. But that was just at one site, and most of the other snow powerwort sites are kind of off the beaten track. So if it does occur, it's incredibly localised, and I'm not so concerned. It's certainly pales in comparison to the impacts of climate change.
Thanks, Sarah. I think you've inspired a lot of people to think about solutions or possible next steps in all of this. Audrey has asked, is there a program to collect and store seeds of the rare plants at risk? Ian has asked, are you planning any, the questions are all around sort of active intervention. Are you planning any intervention, or is any intervention planned in the right places to create and maintain open microhabitats for species requiring them?
Yeah, it's really important to think about the next steps now that we've determined that there's definitely a decline. And it is a challenge in these places, at Ben Lawers, where there's so much, there's barely any habitat left. It's all so high up that you can't just do a really simple kind of translocation thing like you might do for some other species that have been threatened for different reasons. So yeah, I mean, we could look at doing experiments, going down adding a bit of disturbance to keep out some of the vigorous plants. That could be an option, although then you're kind of going down the route of gardening, and I suppose then you're committing to have to keep that up. But that's one tool we have at our disposal. But it's certainly important now, I think, to start ex situ collections of these species. There's been a lot of great conservation work done for some of Arctic alpines, particularly alpine blue south thistle. So the Botanics have done a great program there in conjunction with the Cairngorms to propagate these plants and then transplant them back out. So doing something along those lines, at least ex situ collections for our maybe less charismatic Arctic alpines such as snow pearlwort. I think we really need to do that now, otherwise it could be too late and we could lose the genetic diversity and the genetic resources from these populations if we don't do something very soon.
Okay, you talk about genetics there. Can I ask this question from Martin Auld? Is there any indication through DNA analysis where the Sogina populations have come from?
No,
and when?
I think that's an excellent research question because they are climate relics. So they would have been most likely left here or colonized very quickly after the last ice age and kind of moved uphill as the climate warmed and other plants came in. So they are really unique. So I would be really interested to find out more how closely related they are to other populations in Europe. There has been some more work done on dripping saxifrage, Saxifraga cernua, looking at the genetics of that. And that's a really unusual one because it's thought that most of the populations in Scotland are all from the same clone, because they don't reproduce from seed. It's all done vegetatively in Scotland by these red bulbils. It's just kind of a quirk, I guess, of plants being restricted to places. Being vegetative is a great strategy in combination with flowering as well in Arctic alpine habitats, because you've got a couple of things up your sleeve depending on what the climate's like in that year. You can always fall back on vegetative reproduction, but they kind of get restricted to just doing that in these isolated populations. So if we're talking about conserving genetic resources for drooping saxifrage, I don't know, there's not very much of it in Scotland. So that's one thing to think about. Is there value, would we consider, incorporating genetic diversity from elsewhere in Europe? I don't know, but it's something to consider, certainly for drooping saxifrage anyway.
So, Sarah, can I squeeze in one last question?
Yeah.
Okay, Sarah, this is from David Mitchell. He asks, he says, what a fantastic talk, really enjoyed it. What is the single most important action on the site would be to help conserve these populations?
Yeah, I mean, we can't, as land managers in Scotland, we can't change climate change. That is a difficult one. Well, obviously, collectively, people in Britain are doing that now. That's what they're talking about, COP. But land managers, specifically at NTS, we can't stop that from happening. So it's how you mitigate that for the Arctic alpines, and I suppose, getting ex situ conservation collections, but also now really doing some more rigorous scientific research to actually understanding what's happening to them, in more depth, the processes that are causing these declines, and using applied science to kind of come up with some mitigation actions. So ex situ conservation and scientific research would be my answers.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks, Jim. as ever with the questions. That was fantastic. There are quite a few more questions for you in Q&A. You might have a bit of a
That's good.
session
Yeah.
on those, and some good ones about your research as well. So hopefully those are interesting to you too. But thank you so much.